Hello everyone, welcome to my new YouTube channel and podcast as well, which I've given it a working title, Chatter with Coach. Now, I work as a professional triathlon coach and I'm a personal trainer. But I have had, a good friend of mine, Rachel, suggested, you know what, I think you would do really well if you just release something long form on YouTube that people can stick on in the background while they work. And they can hear you really sort of mull over a subject for a prolonged period of time. So here I am. This is me. I'm Simon Olney. As I said, I've been in the exercise industry, fitness industry really, for a best part of 10 years now. I have a rescued ex-racing greyhound, Poppy, who will no doubt make herself known at some point within the next I don't know how long this is going to take, but made a few notes. And in this first episode, I'm going to be looking at why it is that athletes choose to dope, which is by taking illegal, banned, performance-enhancing drugs. I say sort of illegal, obviously it is within the scope of sport. People can get lengthy bans for it. I think the minimum is 2 years. But in some countries, you can actually face prison time for this. So it's not really a laughing matter. But you can understand a lot of people would say, well, why would somebody take that risk? Why is it that an athlete would run the risk of ruining their career just for the sake of trying to gain sort of what is at the end of the day an unfair advantage? And I want to make this really clear, like blindingly clear. I think doping is a blight on sport. And I think that anyone who gets caught doing it should be hung from the nearest lamppost by their genitals. Okay, I think there was absolutely no place for it in fair sport. The amount of people who invest so much of themselves, their time, their energy, their effort, their money into, sort of endurance sports and strength sports are the areas where it is most prevalent. The amount of effort that people put in to have that undermined by somebody who thinks they're going to take some kind of chemical shortcut, it's bang out of order. However, I am going to try to look past this to an extent and try to understand the human side of it as well. Now, at no point am I trying to defend these people's actions. I'm not trying to justify what it is that they've done. I think that a lot of people who've come forward and have admitted to doping have said, look, I'm not asking for your forgiveness. I know what I did was wrong, but I'm just asking for your understanding as to why I did it. And hopefully, over the course of this video, you start to understand how multi-layered, how complex it can be, and just how difficult it can be to have this strong moral backbone. Because I'd like to think that, if you were to take, very few people go into sport with the aim of cheating. Okay, that's just not really, it's not what we do. Let me just check my microphone's on. Yeah, there we go. Nobody really goes in and goes, you know what, I'm going to be the world's best cyclist and I'm going to take performance-enhancing drugs to get there. Okay, people only they get to this point where they have to make a decision, and you're going to go into it in a little bit as to when that decision would appear and what kind of factors might influence that. But to start with, I've got myself a couple of pages of notes here, so I don't, I've got some numbers, some figures, but I'm definitely going to go off tangent because it's me. So what are performance-enhancing drugs? Well, there are sort of three primary types that you'll generally come across, and these are what are on the World Anti-Doping Association, I think it is, agency. I can't remember off the top of my head. I probably should have written that down. But WADA, they have a list of all of these drugs that they believe give people an unfair advantage. And the list is really sprawling, it's really long. Some of them are really quite obscure, it has to be said. That it would be unlikely that anyone would ever come across these by accident. However, there are others, they can reasonably kind of appear in day-to-day life, in trace elements, in certain foods. Some of the excuses that professional athletes give for testing positive they're equal parts of embarrassing and infuriating. or I must have had a dodgy steak that had this human growth hormone in it. Some of them are really grasping at straws. I've actually got a lot more respect for the dopers who get caught and they go, yeah, you know what? Sorry, that was me. I try. They give their reasoning for it, but they kind of fess up. When you have those who are quite simply sort of just trying to make excuses for themselves or what it is that they're doing, yeah, I've got no time for that. Now, the three primary types of growth hormone, well, not growth hormone, three primary types of performance-enhancing drugs that you will get are anabolic steroids is the first one, which is, most of us will know these as just what we refer to as like steroids or gear in the gym sometimes. And these are what a lot of people actually take to improve their muscle mass. And it's quite contentious because you see some people who they just have like such a build to them that you think, I'm not sure that you could have really achieved that in a clean way. Now, if somebody is just down the gym, and they are lifting simply for themselves and for their vanity, and they see this as being a way for themselves to get bigger, I definitely don't condone it. There are a lot of side effects, lads. It can impair us in the bedroom. There are definitely a lot of negative side effects that come with these. There are a lot of risks. But by the same token, they're not putting anybody else, because it's not being used in a competitive environment. Morally, it's not quite so sort of, it's not really black and white, is it? It's not quite as contentious for me personally. Because they're in their own space and they're taking these to look how it is that they want to look. However, in some sporting environments, they can be used, especially in sort of strength sports, so powerlifting, Olympic weightlifting, shot puts. These even in like contact sports, American football, rugby, all of these. You have people who take these to get themselves as big and strong as they can be. And the downside, sadly, with a lot of these performance enhancing drugs is that once they're in somebody's system and somebody gets the benefit from them, that benefit can then stay with, like a small percentage of that benefit can stay with them sort of for life. They'll never go back to being purely natural, as it were. Which again, it's one of the reasons that I struggle with it. You're putting this in your body for life almost, but again, that does mean that people can gain an advantage for life by doing so. So even if somebody did a load of steroids sort of 5-10 years ago, that could still have an impact on their testosterone levels and their muscle growth and all of that. Human growth hormones are the next ones, which people take to improve their muscle mass and reduce their body fat. It's similar to anabolic steroids in sort of the end result, but it's used a bit more widely. It's not simply sort of pigeonholed around sort of the more strength and bulk sports, which most steroid users really come from. Finally, in endurance sport, the big one is EPO. I'm not going to try and pronounce what it's short for. You can look it up if you're that interested. And there's only so much detail I'm going to go into at some points during this because I don't really want to give some people sort of certain ideas, as it were. But it's what they call a blood booster, and it increases the amount of red blood cells in your bloodstream. Now, if you remember your primary school biology, you will remember that red blood cells, carry oxygen. So whenever I take a breath in, oxygen goes down to my lungs, and then from my lungs, it absorbs the oxygen. So the red blood cells absorb the oxygen and take it to the muscles, where it is used to create muscle contraction. Now, if you are participating in endurance sport, if you're riding a bike, if you're running, what it is that will stop most people from going faster, not everyone, but most people, is that they'll get out of breath. And the reason they're out of breath is because they are simply unable to absorb any more oxygen and get it to their muscles as they need it. The sort of the muscular endurance side of things, where somebody builds that the ability of their muscle to contract tens of thousands of times, over a long distance, that is something that develops a lot quicker than somebody's aerobic system, generally speaking. So for most people, the aerobic system is the glass ceiling that's stopping them from getting any faster. It's sometimes referred to as VO2 max as well. So if you hear people talk about VO2 max, they're referring to their body's sort of maximal uptake of oxygen. And EPO increases the amount of oxygen that you can get to your muscles. So it quite simply, it gives you a big shortcut into sort of helping you just get more oxygen to your muscles, which helps you go faster. I mean, it really is a very, it's a huge boost to somebody's performance. One of the downsides of this is that as your blood gets more red blood cells than it's designed for, that blood does thicken up. And unfortunately, I believe that doping was most rife from sort of the mid 90s into the early 2000s, sort of the Lance Armstrong era. We'll get onto a minute later. But there were points where people would be taking these drugs that would thicken their blood. As a result, because this thick blood is harder to pump, there became a number of professional cyclists, I'm not sure how many, who would actually die in their sleep because their heart rate dropped so low. Because they're asleep, their heart rate drops so low, and the blood is so hard to pump that they pass away in their sleep, and that is really grim. And I heard stories, again, you have to take this with a pinch of salt, but about professional cyclists who would be, when they would go to sleep, they'd wear a chest strap heart rate monitor, and they'd have it attached to a watch, and they would have an alarm go off if their heart rate dropped below 35, 40 beats per minute, whatever the target was. And they'd have a set of rollers that allow them to ride their bike indoors in the hotel room along with their bike. And if this alarm went off, this meant that they were close to maybe being in a medical emergency. And they would then wake up and they'd get their bike and they would ride their bike in the middle of the night on these rollers to help get the blood thinned again, to help make sure that they didn't die in their sleep. It's really dark, really dark. And you kind of think, so it does beg the question, well, why would people make these decisions? Why couldn't they just sort of try naturally? As well as your performance enhancing drugs, you've also got TUEs, which are therapeutic use exemptions, I believe. Realising things I should have actually jotted down instead of TUE. I'm pretty sure it's therapeutic use exemption. And this is something that when an athlete has a condition, asthma is the most common one. And because of their condition, the team doctor gives them permission. Not that the team doctor doesn't give them permission, but they write to the World Anti-Doping Association. And they say, look, an athlete is suffering with this. I'm going to prescribe them with this to help them with their asthma or any other condition. Allergies is another one that people suffer with. So that, I know it's on the performance enhancing list. However, they need this drug to be able to perform properly. And WADA will then go away and they'll consider this, and they'll then come back with the verdict. So, Bradley Wiggins, many of you will know, back in 2011, 2012, and 2013, 2012 being when he won the Tour de France, by the way, he had a TUE for allergies to some kind of pollen, I believe it was. And that kind of places a bit of a dark cloud over the result. Now, the fact is, and I'll expand on this a lot more, that a lot of cyclists in the peloton will have some form of TUE. In fact, it's suggested that a lot of team doctors actually will be very liberal, fast and loose with the dispensation of medication to help their athletes, because they know that if they find any trace of what maybe could be asthma on them, if they then prescribe them this inhaler, this will help their performance. And yes, doctors, they sign all these code of conduct, ethics, they're bound by all of these areas. However, at the end of the day, if your employer is telling you that they want to get as many of their riders on these steroid inhalers as they can, and you turn around and go, oh, well, only one of them was eligible, is somebody going to come and take your job? So it places doctors in a hard position, it has to be said. Chris Froome also used the TUE in 2013 and 2014 for his first 2 Tour de France wins. In 2015, he was leading the Tour de France. He got a chest infection. He was offered an exemption for his chest infection, but he actually refused it. I think he was well ahead in the general classification at that time, and he didn't want his achievement to be overshadowed by the fact that he used a TUE, which I get. Where I do struggle a bit more, honestly, is people who believe that all TUEs should be banned. Which it's just sort of ableism at its finest, really, if you ask me. Anybody who uses sort of any kind of steroid inhaler should be banned from competing in triathlons. So this is even amateurs they're talking about. So if my asthma were to flare up and I were to need salbutamol, which is a sort of a steroid inhaler, then that would prevent me from competing in the sport. And it doesn't seem fair to me to bar anyone except the luckiest. And let's call it what it is. It's privilege, it's luck. The luckiest who don't have any conditions to be able to get a TUE. Now, if there was the budget to monitor amateur sport more than there is, it's very rare that an amateur athlete will get tested, but it does happen at some major events occasionally. Then I think, I think there could be a bit more of a discussion around that. But I think that it comes from people who are just sort of quite privileged and have this very black and white approach on what it is that shouldn't be allowed. Moving on from the TUEs, I'm going to talk about how it is that people sort of find themselves. Let me wet my whistle. Tip: if you fill one of these bad boys up at the start of the day, try to drain it before the end of the day. It's going to go a long way to making sure you stay hydrated. A lot of cyclists. I'm going to be talking a fair bit about cycling here because it was it's sort of especially bad for road cycling due to the highly aerobic nature of it. If you're riding up a mountain, then if you are taking EPO, you will go faster. It's pretty clean cut. But yeah, as I said, nobody really goes in. Not many people, at least, go into sport thinking I'm going to dope. But what will have happened in the mid 90s to the early noughties, where it was most prevalent, is that a rider would get to a certain point, and it would be either their team, coach, or a doctor would sort of take them aside and go, you know what, you're doing brilliantly, but you know what would really help you? This. And the vast majority of people, their initial reaction, this isn't the past, I'm going to talk in the present tense, their initial reaction will be, no, or at least they will be resistant to it. Not many people are going to jump at it with both hands. But there comes a point, if you were to refuse that, you wouldn't get a contract for that team, or you'd lose your job. So you get a lot of people who come into, again, I know it's slightly unfair, me always coming back to the professional cycling example, but we're talking about Lance Armstrong, what it is that he did in a bit, so it seems to want to keep it on trend. It seems that it is really a choice between, well, do you want to be a cyclist or not? Because if you want to be a cyclist, then you're going to have to get off your high horse and you have to do what everybody else, all the other cyclists are doing. At least that's what it's made out to be. You're just leveling the playing field. You're just giving yourself a chance. Because if you don't, then, you'll get absolutely ruined. And some people can afford to have the morals and some people will step away from it. I'd like to think that all of us think in our heads, like, no, I wouldn't do that. I would, I'd shut the door on that. I'd walk away. But if you've dedicated the last several years of your life to becoming a professional or an elite cyclist, and you're suddenly faced with this decision, going, do you compromise on your morals, or do you stay on your high horse and go and find something else to do with your life? It's not easy. Again, we'd all like to think we turn it down. I wouldn't even consider it as cheating, it's unfair. But if somebody is placed in that position where it is their livelihood, their dream to become a professional cyclist, and all they need to do to make that happen is to take this tablet, this testosterone tablet. It's hard for me really to imagine. I mean, I'd like to think myself as being a very kind of moral person. Personally, I think I've got a pretty good moral compass. But then again, so do we all, right? But I'd like to think that I'd say no. But again, if I was a professional athlete, if I went into this a bit naively, I don't know how I'd feel. Now, I don't think that is nearly as prevalent anymore, it has to be said. Now, it would be incredibly naive of me to say this, you know what, doping is a thing of the past. Nobody takes performance-enhancing drugs anymore. That was a product of the Lance Armstrong era. Everyone's clean now. I know full well that's not going to be the case. It's just the fact that, like, doping is a bit of an arms race between the athletes and the doctors that enable them, the chemists and everyone involved with that, and the anti-doping agencies who are trying to find tests for these. However, what I do push back against is the concept that just because somebody is winning all the races, that they must be doping. Lance Armstrong was the best cyclist of his era, hands down. Like, there is, Lance Armstrong could have probably been the only clean rider in the peloton, and he still may have won a Tour de France. Maybe not all 7, but he may have won a Tour de France. He was just on that next level to everyone else. However, it's again, it's you look at Tadej Pogačar at the moment and Jonas Vingegaard, who are the two contenders for the yellow jersey in this year's Tour de France. And some people will see them ride up a mountain away from everyone else and go, "Oh, they're doping." You can't just like jump to these conclusions. Yes, they were cut above everybody else in the field, but the chances are, if they were doping, so would their teammates. One of the big issues with Lance Armstrong is that he made this decision to use performance-enhancing drugs, which is an immoral decision. But then the way that he bullied and imposed on everyone else around him to also take these drugs, that's more the issue for me personally. Where it's about the bullying, it's about the intimidation, it's about everything else that comes with that. But if Tadej Pogačar was doping, again, I don't think he is personally, but if he was, his domestiques, those who work with him to set him up in the mountains, would also be in on it. Probably also taking it as well. It's unlikely that he'd be gaining access to what he needs in isolation. It's possible, of course. But to be able to link everything up with the evasion of the testing and all that comes with that, it's an enormous undertaking to be able to cheat in this day and age. Again, I'm sure it still happens. I'm sure that riders are using substances which aren't yet on the banned list, or that they've found ways to skirt the benefits of. But I think the era of like blatant EPO doping, which is the most potent of these blood boosting drugs, the era of that sort of blatant EPO abuse, I think, is behind us for the most part, at least I hope. But yeah, just because somebody's doing really well doesn't mean that somebody is going to is just going to be on another level to everybody else. Lance Armstrong was a once in a generation talent. Tadej Pogačar is a once in a generation talent. And I think that everybody who the vast majority at least of those that Lance rode against in the Tour de France peloton were also doping. I know that people take sort of the figure of Marco Pantani, who tragically lost his life in part due to the doping accusations against him. I believe it's sort of the depression that it caused him and drug abuse that came with that to help him cope. But all of those he was up against were also doping. He was just always going to be on another level, and that is one of the interesting parts. Is that people respond to performance-enhancing drugs differently based on their physiology. So you will have some who will take they'll take EPO or any other banned substance, and they will be like a rocket ship. It will be really visible. Whereas there are others who will see a small or a modest improvement. So it is, again, it affects people in different ways. And it could be that if there is a large-scale doping operation in modern-day sport, it could well be that the team leaders, the individuals who are like way above everyone else, they're just sort of hyper responders to this. But honestly, I'm not sure that's really sort of the case, as it were. So if you look at a brief history of doping, I believe it was again, something I should have checked before I press record, in the late 60s, early 70s, where sort of WADA was formed and they tried to control. Are you right down there? Where they decided they needed to control some of the substances that were flying around. People talked about it relatively openly to their teammates and everybody else. Tommy Simpson, who was a British cyclist, died on Mont Ventoux, a very famous cycling climb in France, and largely due to the performance-enhancing drugs that he was using. But anyway, when it really started out, it started out as being sort of stimulants, so things such as cocaine and amphetamines that are relatively easy to come across, that people would take for a bit of a pick-me-up, a bit of a hit. Whether that would be probably be before races, maybe sometimes during. The early Tour de France was a very strange. If you don't know much about the history of the Tour de France, it is worth reading up on. Sort of the first races, it was sort of like 12, 14 people trying to literally cycle a lap of France. You'd have some that would just get on trains and just blatantly cheat like that, because there wasn't the same way of tracking people. It was 1913, I believe, that they had the first. Oh no, it wasn't, because the 100th Tour de France was 2013, but they missed some for the war. So I couldn't tell you exactly when the first Tour de France was off the top of my head. But obviously, thankfully, it's evolved over time. But yeah, people would have just been, using sort of cocaine to keep them going over these horrendously long, sort of up to like 700-kilometer stages they had to ride. I mean, who's getting through that without some kind of synthetic help? Well, some ultra cyclists, I'm sure they'd fancy the challenge. Then it moved on to sort of anabolic steroids, which again, it wasn't necessarily super popular in endurance sports, but they were the next sort of discovery. After that, EPO came along, which again was a massive hit with endurance sports, enormous. Then after the techniques for detecting EPO got better, a lot of people moved on to blood transfusions. And this is where people would often, I think, take EPO before, but they would have a blood draw from them. So they have a needle in their arm and they would take a pint of blood. And that would then be either refrigerated or frozen, depending on the time scale. And that would then be taken with the riders to France. And over the course of the tour, they would then reinfuse ahead of a big stage. So if it was a big mountain stage the next day, in the evening they go into their hotel room, and apparently they'd hook up a hanger on sort of a painting or something like that in a hotel room, so to get it nice and high. And they'd have a blood bag on the coat hanger, and they would just have it down into intravenous drip. And they would, apparently, it was a very unusual sensation to feel cold blood entering your veins. I'm sure as hell it is. But they, and they would, because that was undetectable, because they were simply taking blood that had a higher oxygen content into somebody's system. And you can't really test how recently somebody had blood transfused into them, because EPO is detected via a urine test. Also, sometimes they'll take blood tests as well for certain drugs. I can't pretend to know the exact ins and outs of what they test and when, but they would do these tests. But if you were just using a higher red blood cell count blood and infusing it into your body, it gives you an unfair advantage. And it's one of those things that it's very hard to prove that somebody has or hasn't done it as well. And it's something that's been sort of more of a habit in recent years as the detection has just got better. It's been what they call microdosing. So they have a look at the tests that WADA use, and they will try to find at what level it becomes detectable, because they have to give a margin of error. The point that if there is the slightest minimalist concentration of what could be a banned substance in somebody's blood, that's not a smoking gun. There will be a level. So there have been teams, individuals, doctors playing around with what is the minimum dose that we can give people to be able to help them, improve. So I'm going to move on now, talking to a chap who some of you may know about, called Tyler Hamilton, who was one of Lance Armstrong's teammates and sort of a close friend of Lance. And he's the one who blew the whistle. He wrote a book called The Secret Race, and he highlighted everything that was going on under Lance Armstrong. And one of the reasons that Lance got away with it for so long was that he bullied and intimidated people. But obviously Tyler Hamilton, he obviously felt that he didn't have much to lose at this point. So he wrote this book about everything that went on in the US postal team, and how widespread it was throughout the peloton. I mean, fair play to him for writing that book. It's an interesting read. I recommend that you have a look if you're interested in the subject. But he says in that book that you could attach them to the very best, the most sophisticated lie detector in the world, and ask them if they thought they were cheating, and they'd say no, I'm not getting an unfair advantage, because they really believed it. They didn't believe that they weren't cheating. They knew that they were cheating, but they did not believe that they were getting an advantage. It's that they simply saw it as being, it's just what everybody did. And I'm sure there were some people in the peloton, at that time who didn't dope, but they would have, if you are racing up against a bunch of other people who have got really sort of souped up systems, the chance of you actually be able to win anything in that era is quite difficult. And that is one of the moral quandaries, really, surrounding, we strip Lance Armstrong's wins away from him. But that just means that the person who came in second was also doping. Obviously, I appreciate the ASO who run the Tour de France. They had to be seen to do something. They can't just sort of shrug and go, well, we all knew what happened at that time. But, again, there's no way of knowing whether somebody's really sort of clean or not, especially when you go all that way back. It was a global network, really, that helped supply and provide them with everything they needed. The Tour de France is an absolute behemoth in the cycling calendar. I remember in COVID 2020, they were wondering whether it was going to go ahead or not. And I think people said it was responsible for like 85 and 90% of a team's commercial income. It was just, it's just mad how much the Tour brings in. And the fact was that if the Tour got cancelled, then like most cycling teams would probably go bankrupt. The professional cycling would most likely collapse, and with it, lots of sponsors. It would be an enormous domino effect. Thankfully, that didn't happen. But it was the Tour de France was what everything was based around, and the logistics, the doctors, the supply chains, the coaches, the riders, everything. It was this secret underground network that was smuggling performance-enhancing drugs. Some of you may remember, I want to say, I think it's got a 3 in it, so I'm going to say 2003. I could be very wrong. The Festina team, cycling team, a team car was stopped at the border when they were at a checkpoint, and they searched the car and they found large quantities of EPO in the car. So this isn't a branded team car with team personnel inside it. This is how widespread it was. I mean, they were really daft to do that. I'm sure, I mean, if memory serves, I think they found it like underneath. It was well hidden within the car itself. They didn't just toss it in the back seat. But it was a huge operation. I remember that one of the facts I read is that after a stage of the Tour de France, or sometimes before, I'm not sure exactly the dosing for these, but the US Postal Riders, they would arrive in the team bus, and somebody would bring the EPO out, and they'd all inject themselves, and they'd stick the needle in a Coke can, and they'd then sort of crumple up the Coke can and just chuck it in the rubbish. And that's how they concealed what it is that they're up to. You know, this isn't just one person who's going, oh, I'm going to get an unfair advantage, I'm going to beat everybody else by taking EPO. This is an enormous system, like absolutely huge. And it really is sort of a race, as I alluded to earlier. It's a race between doping, the people, you know, sort of doping as much as they can, as fast as they can, sort of trying to discover new ways to do it, and the anti-doping. So the dopers are trying to find new ways to gain an advantage, and the anti-dopers are trying to find sort of the anti-doping sort of personnel, scientists, doctors, trying to find ways to detect what it is that they're doing. They're trying to play catch up. And one of the things that Tyler Hamilton said is that our doctors are a lot better, or at least a lot better paid than those at WADA. Yeah, it's hard to argue that, really, isn't it? So this is, it becomes an arms race, essentially. And, you know, again, I'd like to think that sort of that gap has narrowed a little bit. The number of people who've been caught for performance-enhancing drugs has reduced. So, I mean, I guess it means one of two things, doesn't it, really? Either, you know, everybody's back on the gear like the good old days, and it's widespread, but nobody knows how to detect it, or the testing has just become so good that it's deemed to be not worth the risk anymore. I'd like to think it was the latter. The optimist in me believes it's the latter. I'd like to think that if there was such a huge operation as that going on within the peloton, that somebody would have said something by now. I mean, it's one thing in Lance's era when you'd have to go on the record yourself, whereas in the world of the internet, anonymity, just being anonymous when you make a report to the police or journalists or that, you know, I'd like to think that something would have leaked by now, but you know, we never really know, do we? Right, you need another drink. So this brings us on to Lance Armstrong. And he, like, it's impossible to think about doping and performance-enhancing drugs without thinking about Lance. And on the one hand, he has been the fall guy for everything that happened in the peloton at that time, which feels slightly unfair. But by the same token, he was also, by and large, the architect of a lot of it. So is it that unfair, really? Okay, I don't know what happened on those team buses in those conversations. Very few people ever do or ever will. But a bit about our boy Lance. So he started, I think, when he was 16. He started racing triathlon until he was 19, when he then went to go and focus on professional cycling. At the age of 21, in 1993, he became the world champion in the men's road race, which essentially it's one of, if not the biggest, one-day race in the world. And he won that at the tender age of 21, which I believe was the first American to do so, and also the youngest person to ever do that. Now, the fact is, I mean, he said, Lance Armstrong in his confession said that he had been doping since the mid-1990s. Whether 1993 counts as the mid-1990s, I don't know. It could be that he raced the world's clean and he won it clean, or it could be that he was already doping by that point. Hard to say. I don't want to set myself up for too much in the way of libel here. But he is, he won this race, and he was clearly this enormous talent. He was then, I think, only a few years later, got diagnosed with testicular cancer, which then spread to his abdomen, his lungs, his lymph nodes. They removed the testicle in question, started some aggressive chemotherapy, and they discovered some tumours in his brain as well. And he only had a 40% chance of survival. And regardless of what else he did with his life, you have to admire what he did with Livestrong and raising money for cancer and awareness. And I mean, the fact that he overcame it, it's incredible, really. He beat the odds, partly through luck, let's be honest, but also partly due to, sort of willpower, chemotherapy. Thankfully, I've never done it, never had anyone go through it who's close to me. But from what I understand, it is a thoroughly miserable experience. So, fair play to him for pushing through all that, regardless of sort of what else he did afterwards. But it's still, he's an incredibly flawed character, because he was the architect behind the whole anti-doping program. He is the one who brought people in, who bullied people into taking these. This is the way that it was going to go. I've done this. I've got these results. This is what we need to do if we want to be the best team in the world. And as he was sort of the comeback kid after sort of beating testicular cancer and coming back to professional cycling, which is incredible. I think a lot of people gave him the benefit of the doubt in some ways. This man survived cancer. He's so fast. If he says that he's clean, he must be clean. Or I think the line he tended to repeat a lot was, "I've never failed a drugs test." You can't argue with the fact that he absolutely, a lot of people would have seen him with rose tinted glasses, really, which I get, and he's such a complicated character, and I've said this, a good few times already. But I think that the issue that I have is not so much with the fact that he did it. It's the fact that he helped. I'm not going to say he started, but he helped create that culture, that how it all spread around the team and the peloton. And that's, I think that he didn't realise or didn't care about the effect that it had on other people, the turmoil that it caused people, the damage that it did to sort of different people's sort of livelihoods and families. And I do wonder, again, I do wonder whether Lance might have something of a kind of sociopathic, psychopathic kind of tendency, where he just doesn't really empathise with the positions of others. And it was more, I want to be the best rider that I can be, and I'm going to do everything that I can do to achieve that, and I don't really care how it affects other people. I think there was a little bit of that, just that, that self-belief coming back from cancer, thinking probably sort of felt he was a bit of a chosen one in some cases, and that he was going to do whatever it took to win. Something I'm going to cover now is, is that the right way to do it? Yeah. If you haven't seen his interview with Oprah Winfrey that he did in 2013, it's worth a watch. I respect the way that he held that interview and how sort of candid. I mean, his hand was forced by this point, really. But I respect him for coming out with the admission that he did in the way that he did. Really very publicly, and sharing everything surrounding it. But talk about testing, how it is that they catch dopers, and why it is that Lance Armstrong never failed a drugs test. So there were two types of testing that you can do. Well, you can get and that's in competition testing and out of competition testing. Now, in competition testing, it can start, I believe, from just about midnight the day before the competition. So the day before the Tour de France starts is when the testers, they will then go around and they can then start collecting samples from people. And then you have out of competition testing, which is where the testers can turn up at your house and say, we'd like a sample, please. Which, I mean, you have to be a bit dumb to be caught with in-competition testing, because you know that you're going to be tested. And you will either have had to get the dosage wrong, or something would have had to happen at some point for you to get popped during a in competition testing. And the out of competition testing is really where people get caught. So the way athletes have to fill in a whereabouts form, and it is one of the sort of it must be a really big ball and chain as a professional athlete, but it's part of their job at the end of the day. I understand that mistakes happen, but and I think every athlete misses a test occasionally. But if somebody misses 3 tests, then that is a ban, and they go. They have reason to suspect at that point that somebody's evading the anti-doping testers because they are trying to conceal something. And I think this is a very fair rule. However, this is sort of it's very hard on the athletes, because it's very difficult for them to say, oh, let's pop down the road and get a coffee. Because if they do, and the testers turn up at their door 30 seconds after they leave, and they haven't filled out their whereabouts form to inform the testers that they'll be at the coffee place or they go shopping, then then they end up with a strike against them. Again, I think a lot of athletes will miss a test here and there. But again, 3 in a row is either suspicious or careless, and either way, I do think the ban is justified at that point. And so those are the ways that people will be tested, and the testing procedure is that a sort of a WADA representative will escort an athlete often from the finish line of the event. They'll take them into a private area without the tester letting them out of their sight, and it's a tester of the same sex as them, and they then watch them pass urine into a container. Now, I know that at the Olympics, certainly, maybe in some other events, they'll take an A sample and they'll take a B sample. So they'll take an A sample, which will be the one that will be tested immediately. I don't know how long this has been going for, but they test the A sample immediately. They get, is there anything suspicious in there? No. Okay, that's fine. And the B sample is then often frozen and put into storage. So they then have that as a record, so that if there are any irregularities further down the road, they can then look back. If they can perhaps even detect things that we can't detect now, they can go back and they can work out how is it that they got away with that. Not got away with that, but is there anything we need to look out for in the future? And they will sometimes test the A sample and the B sample if something comes back as being slightly inconclusive. But you've got 2 samples to make it harder for there to be a misaccusation. And I do feel for athletes who have a accusation levied against them, because you can't put that cat in the box. Once it's out, it's out. Once people are whispering around that you're a doper, it's very difficult to prove that you're not. Which is why I wish people were a bit more careful with their language on social media, if I'm honest. Calling out people, oh, they must be doping, or oh, they're a doper. These are the kind of things that are incredibly hard to disprove. If somebody were to accuse me of doping personally, or of working with athletes, of enabling athletes, that's the kind of thing that, it could have an enormous impact on my career. And so just because somebody's doing well, just because somebody has really seen an improvement in their performance, doesn't mean that someone is doping. And last year, an athlete was suspended for doping. about this time last year in triathlon, which got sort of tongues wagging, because within the sport of triathlon, I can turn my page now. Within the sport of triathlon, there's not a lot of people out there who I think really dope. I think it's definitely a minority of people who engage in that behaviour, at the professional level at least, and when people come out and they point fingers at people, they accuse them of this, of that. It is, especially like a small sport like triathlon. It is really difficult to come back from that. And some of there was somebody who had I'm not going to name them, somebody who had a positive test not too long ago, who their argument was that they picked up those trace elements of it during sexual contact with their partner, who was having something that contained it at the time. And again, like, if she's telling the truth about that, then that's not really her fault. That is the decision that her partner. I think her partner was taking a supplement that had something that was banned inside of it. And it's not her fault, but equally it could just be a big porky pie that she's telling. But we can't pretend that we don't know about it. We can't pretend that didn't happen, and that's really difficult. How easy it is to throw around these accusations about people cheating. Going to stick on the topic of triathlon now. I think that in the professional cycling world, really, it's a very team structure. You have your director sportif, you have your team doctors. I think there's a lot of pressure coming from there. Then it is a case of, look, do you want to dope or do you want to quit the sport? At least in years gone by. I think in triathlon, it's not nearly as bad because everybody races as an individual or for a national governing body. Now, I believe triathlon is inherently a cleaner sport than most. Certainly cleaner than a lot of strength sports, I would wager. And also because athletes, they work, especially, even national governing bodies, they still do a lot of their training and coaching sort of on their own. They work with a lot of external coaches. But if somebody is a middle or long distance athlete, they're essentially a self-employed professional triathlete who's living off of sponsorships, and there isn't that same pressure from other areas around them. Now, there will of course be pressure to perform. Sponsorship deals will, they'll give them bonuses if they manage to podium or win races, or even sort of place highly, qualify for the Olympics, whatever that may be. But there isn't that same immediate horrid pressure on people that you can get. There's also less collateral, I think, is probably the easiest way to do it, because there are less people involved in this web. It's just that person and their inner circle, that not as many people sort of get hurt. So it's almost not as much as a problem in some ways. It doesn't affect as many other people if somebody does dope. Now, of course, if a doper wins a race, I believe an athlete won one of the T100 races shortly before he was caught. And I think he did actually fess up to it, actually, so fair play to him. But yeah, he won that money, and he took those winnings away from a clean athlete. Now, the PTO, who run the T100 series, they didn't actually ask for the winnings back. I don't know, there could be some legal reason for that, which I felt didn't sit right with me, personally at least. But it's just an incredibly selfish thing to do, especially in a sport like triathlon, where it is all about individual achievement. You're not doping just to keep up with your team leader to set them up, because that's the only way that you can earn a living. You are doping because you want an unfair advantage. So how can we avoid ending up with any of these sort of illegal substances in our body? Chances are you're probably never going to get tested, let alone caught. However, it might happen. And if you were tested at an event, which is especially likely if you are, a very good athlete, that you could find yourself not only losing the result from that race, but also being banned from the sport that you love because of your ingestion of these banned substances. And you need to look for a logo on nutrition, which is informed sport. And this suggests that any sort of supplements that you get, from energy drinks to gels, anything like that, has been tested in a lab, and each batch is tested to ensure it does not contain any banned substances. If you were to go down to your local gym supplement shop and you should grab a protein powder off the shelf, there's a good chance there could be something in there. Again, not a high chance, it's a good chance that there could be something in that protein powder that is banned under the WADA or the UK anti-doping, US anti-doping, wherever you are in the world, under those guidelines. So you do need to you need to be mindful. You need to show common sense with it, really. And I would definitely, I definitely avoid being sort of drawn into too much in the way of of discussion around it all, or doing too much research on what things happen, what these do, because if somebody were to look at that into your search history, if you did get caught, again, it doesn't look great. But again, you just being open, being honest, being careful of what it is that you eat, of any drugs that you take. If you are competing, you're on some medication, you can, as an amateur, apply for a TUE. So if you are looking to qualify to represent your age group at a sort of a major event, such as the World Championships, and you go there and you need to take some medication for allergies that you have, you would need to make sure that you get a TUE for that, to make sure that you don't get pinged if you do end up getting tested. Challenge Roth, which is a really big triathlon, this sort of a couple of weeks ago, and no, it was a Sunday just gone actually. They did the most widespread testing of amateur athletes they claimed ever, which I think is pretty good. I've got time for that. I think because there is an estimation that around about 10% of endurance athletes, amateur athletes, have taken some performance enhancing substances. Now these are primarily testosterone, and it tends to be men over 50, I believe, who are trying to up their testosterone levels sort of naturally, and they tell themselves they're just leveling the playing field and making up for a discrepancy. No, they're cheating. As soon as you're taking a testosterone tablet, you are cheating. You should not be in the sport. But I forgot where I was going with that now. How long did I make it? Oh, being over nearly an hour, and that's the first time I've lost my train of thought. That's not too bad, that, for the first episode. And yeah, there's no excuse for it, basically. If you were to get caught, if you were using any of these products, then I mean, just have a word with yourself. If you're trying to convince yourself that maybe it might be right, no, it's okay. Everybody else is doing it. No, they're not. A lot of people don't have time for that. All the money either. It's very expensive. Which brings me on to the final part of today. I'm going to give you a film recommendation. The film is called Icarus. If you haven't seen it, you have to see it. It's on Netflix, I believe. You absolutely have to find. Do you mind? You absolutely have to, find some time or a way to watch it if you have interest in this subject. I don't want to spoil it too much because it's a fantastic story. I remember showing it to a girlfriend of mine, and she was just stunned. She has no real interest in sport, but she was just stunned by the contents of it. So definitely give it a look. But the very basic premise is there's a chap who wants to take on a major cycling event, and he wants to be a guinea pig for doping to see how much difference it makes, how much it changes his performance relative to last year. And he goes down this rabbit hole, and this advisor that's helping him with the doping program then ends up, being under investigation by Russian authorities. And again, I don't want to ruin it, but if you've enjoyed this, if you find it interesting and useful, please do take the time to go and watch Icarus, because I think you'll really enjoy it and you'll find it very useful and interesting. So I want to reiterate, I'll leave it there, I think. Loads of sport. I know it feels like I've been picking on cycling, and triathlon is my sport, which is why I've put a bit more focus on there. But please, whilst we do need to demonise doping, we do need to have an understanding of the human behind it all. If somebody is doping as an amateur, that's just small dick energy. Sorry, that's really bang out of order. But especially like historically, a lot of people who sort of were given these impossible choices to make. We do need to sort of understand exactly just what the choice was in front of them. And yes, we can judge them and we can think less of them, but it's worth remembering. And before we go throwing accusations around social media, just understanding how multifaceted, how complicated it is. On the one hand, it's very black and white. Doping, bad. Natural, good. And we do need, morally, it's totally black and white. But when people are placed in very difficult positions by people who have bad intentions at the top of teams and team leaders and the like, the team leaders, the doctors, they've made that decision. They've gone bad. They go, look, we're going to do what it takes to win. There's too much money in this for us not to. So they've made that decision. But they are the ones who then drag other people who are, who really don't want to do that kind of thing with them as well. So it's an interesting first episode, I must say. This was actually a subject that Rachel suggested that that she wanted to hear me talk about. So thank you, Rachel, for this first episode, as well as suggesting the idea in the first place. So if you are interested in triathlon, swimming, cycling, or running, okay, I have Phase on Triathlon, which is my coaching business, my primary business, where I do bespoke one-to-one coaching, training plans, and I also have some standalone courses on subjects such as strength training and fat loss, all areas like that. On the other hand, I have a second business called Greyhound Fitness, which is it's sort of essentially, I don't do bespoke work there. I'm simply making lots of training plans, lots of programs around strength, nutrition, swimming, cycling, and running. So if you only practice one of the sports and you want to get better at that, do go have a look there. Okay, there's some. If you especially if you enjoyed this episode, go take a look, because you'll have me explaining these concepts to you. All about strength work, all about training, all about the tactics. Again, it's a relatively new business, Greyhound Fitness, so there's not as much content as I would like there at the moment. It's just getting off the ground. But yeah, Phase on Triathlon, definitely. If you want to have a chat with me, if you found this useful, you have any questions, drop me an email. We use simon@phaseontriathlon.com. Use that as my email address. I'll stick the links to what I've discussed today down into either the show notes on your podcast platform or into the description on YouTube. Yeah, I hope you've enjoyed this. It's been an interesting experience for me, just monologuing for just about an hour. Thank you for your time. Thank you for joining me. I hope that I've been an interesting companion and that you've learned a few things. If you have enjoyed this, I would appreciate it if you liked, subscribed, all those things like that. Share it with your friends. I don't really know where I want to go with this. It may be that it's something that I do choose to sort of to monetize at some point further down the line. It may be that I keep this free, as I want to sort of keep it as sort of a platform for people to come and to learn more about me and find out more about my platform. I'm not sure. I see how I feel, but I need to get 1,000 followers before I even have to make that decision. So yes, thank you once again for your company. Poppy was relatively well behaved, other than some sighing, some grumbling, and sort of kicking me in the back of the leg there. I'm sure she'll show her face at another point though. So, thank you for your company. Take care of yourself. Train hard. And I'll see you soon.